Hello and welcome to the Designer Bookbinders online lecture series. Before I introduce our speaker, I've just got a little bit of housekeeping to do. I've even written it down, which is fantastic. I'd just like to remind our online audience that you are muted. We would appreciate it if you would remain muted, background noise and that sort of thing, etc., etc., etc. And time permitting, there will be a question and answer question. Well, I hope there'll be answers session after the lecture's been given. Please post your questions in the box, the chat box, which is somewhere down there. To get the best viewing screen of whatever it is, please remember it may not be full screen. On your computer, please click on the viewing option, which is somewhere up there. Not yet, just when the slides start. And select hide video panel for your viewing pleasure. Anyway, housekeeping out the way, it gives me great delight, sincere pleasure to be able to introduce our first speaker, well, our own speaker for tonight, which is the myth, the legend that is Lester Capon. Take it away, Lester.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for that fulsome introduction, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining me for this talk. We'll see a selection of my bindings made over several decades, and sometimes descriptions of how they were put together. Now, the title of this talk, as you can see, is A Little Too Much is Just Enough for Me. So I'm afraid if you're looking for minimalism, you've come to the wrong shop. It's a quote, by the way, 20th century filmmaker, artist, writer, and addict, Jean Cocteau. So I've been a member of DB since sometime in the mid-70s, and I was elected a fellow in 1986. So let me take you all the way back, if I may, to 1986, to one of my first commissions. Skylab Explores the Earth, a rather strange title and subject for a design binding. The owner, the late Lord Woodington, collected modern bindings and atlases and Bibles, so this started off in his atlas selection, and I hope and presume it ended in his modern binding section. The book, with a rather exciting title inside, was Dull, Dull, Dull. As I remember it, there were lots of greyish, uninspiring photos and diagrams with lots of dense technical text, which I certainly wasn't going to read. So I just took the title and invented things around that. I made roundels out of millboard and covered them in textured and stained calf and other leathers. They're all alluding to radio waves, laser beams, eclipses, the Earth's terrain, but not done in any way a scientist would recognise. These roundels were then inserted into square recesses. And over the years, I've quite often divided the boards into compartments, and it's a way I like to work if it seems suitable for the book. Only trouble is you have to think up several different designs rather than just the one. This was a commission about the same time. It's a Rampant Lions Press book, and the text is by Samuel Beckett. It's called As the Story Was Told. A very nice production, as always, by Rampant Lions. The boards have been covered separately in a light brown calf and subsequently stained with leather dyes, and the perimeter of the boards were then blind tooled. The boards were attached to the black calf spine hinges and reinforced with aero linen. It's a very similar construction, I think, to what is now referred to as simplified binding. I remember worrying a bit about it at the time because it wasn't laced in boards as such. But although I'm sure it could be ripped apart if someone really had a mind to, I reckon it's safe enough and strong enough to be opened and shut forever and a day. The central black calf strip that runs across the board opens up and it reveals an imagined text underneath. This is red goatskin with leather onlays. I did this because the meaning of Beckett's text is often rather hidden, and even upon further investigation can be somewhat inscrutable. I placed a small piece of thin metal on the underside of the black calf that you can see there on the left, and underneath the red leather strip there is a very small thin magnet to keep it closed. The whole design is referring very much to the appearance of the printing inside. Every page has this central line of text with notes around the edges of the pages. Salmastus and Hermaphroditus, a Golden Cockerel press book. Again, very early binding of mine. The images in this book were very watery. The illustrator was John Buckland Wright. So I gave this a sort of murky underwater look by staining calf inlays with leather dyes and surrounding them with crumpled onlays or puckered onlays. I'd actually bound this same copy of the book previously when I was a licentiate for the competition, which I did win a prize, but the book was lying around doing nothing, and money was short in those days, so I decided to redo it thus. And this one did sell, thankfully. Moving quite a lot forward, I was asked with several others to bind a copy of Bernard's book, Recollections. This has the twin values of being very amusing and very informative, and I urge anyone who hasn't read it to get hold of a copy as soon as possible. Of course, when we think of Bernard, we think of his vast knowledge and association with the history of bookbinding. So I decided to do a design which refers to the many different types of spine decoration that have been made over the centuries. Some of the spines from the past with differing onlays and tooling, not just run-up gilt spines, but earlier ones in the various panels are really beautiful and inspiring, I find. The design also acknowledges, to a certain extent, different board attachments. Some of the elements from this spine creep around onto the boards. So all the activity for the design revolves around the spine and hinge area. This was the first of what I call my totem pole bindings. I did a few. I'm just going to show you one other here. This, obviously, Iliad and Odyssey, Homer. I think I might have done this around about 1999, not too sure. This was a commission from a bookshop, which never usually went anywhere near modern design binding. As I remember, we'd got talking at an ABA fair and found we have friends in common from my days when I was working as an antiquarian bookseller in London many years ago. Anyway, they had these two large volumes of Homer, and they asked me to do a design binding on them. They struck me as ideal candidates for totem pole binding. So I played around with the spines as before, particularly using some Greek pottery colours. I decided to make a double slipcase for them instead of the usual drop-back box. This allowed the spines to be admired by the owners forevermore. Anyway, they hated it. We had a conversation, and I think they had expected a design on each board, possibly even slightly traditional. They obviously didn't understand or share my love of the spinal history of books. Fortunately, they did pay up, but I've never heard from them since. I hope they managed to sell it. This was a commission from the City of Liverpool Central Library. By the way, when one first starts giving talks, you're told often, never apologise for your slides. But I do apologise for some of these early ones. They are not desperately professional. So this was a commission from the City of Liverpool Central Library as part of their celebration of the award of European Capital of Culture 2008. According to my notes, I bound this in 2005, which must be when they commissioned it. It's hard to believe, 3 years ahead of schedule. It's not the way I normally operate, and I don't think it's the way most bookbinders operate. Anyway, they asked me for something with the theme of learning, so I chose an encyclopedia to encompass all areas of learning. Obviously, this wasn't a private press book, which is usually preferable for design bindings, but it was a nice publication and a good size to work on. If I was doing this talk live, I might be asking everybody to guess what some of these panels represented, but obviously I can't do that. And even if I could, you're all muted. So I'll tell you just a few of them. Top front board, top left, represents history, and this is represented by an image of Elizabeth I peering out through time from behind a calfskin panel. Centre left, just below that, is mathematics. And I copied these images from a diagram in Sir Jonas More's New System of Mathematics, published in the late 17th century. I think I was repairing a copy of it at the time. and I was rather taken with this particular layout. I have absolutely no idea what it means, but I know it's mathematical. Bottom right is geology. That's done with the Earth's layers are made up of pieces of reverse goatskin. The backboard, I won't do all of them, but the top left is architecture. This is taken from a drawing of a canon of architecture, and this configuration is also used in printing to determine the size of the text and margins on a page. So that gold represents where the printing would be on a page, with a generous margin at the tail and the forage. Next to that is natural history. Unfortunately, it's not very clear on this image. I took a photograph of some birds in a colour plate book I was repairing. Can't remember what the book was, but they were very nice hand colour pictures. And I covered the photograph with semi-transparent vellum to make it a bit more mysterious. But in this image, perhaps it's a little bit too mysterious. You'll have to trust me on this one. There are birds under there. Middle left is space, nice piece of figured vellum acting as the moon. And bottom left is literature. I spent a long time looking for suitable quotes. I sprinkled a bit of calf for the panel to make it look like a sort of an old library book. And I finally chose this text, which is the beginning of a sentence. It's not the whole sentence, which says the universe, which others call the library, which I think is a great beginning for a sentence. It's from a short story called The Library of Babel by, forgive the pronunciation, Jorge Luis Borges, one of my favourite authors, but I can't pronounce his name very well. So that is Phillips Encyclopedia. And we move on. This is my first pierced vellum binding for an exhibition in Brussels at the Bibliotheca Wittokiana way back. It's an alembic press book called Pattern Poems by George Herbert. And shaped poetry is something I associate with the 1960s, really, concrete poetry, the appearance of the poem adding meaning to the words. Here we have shaped poems in Elizabethan times, which apparently were not uncommon. I decided to make patterns running horizontally across both boards and establish the size and number of these by spacing out the title down the spine and letting each row correspond to an individual letter. An extra row was added for the space between the two words. This gave me an all-over pattern design for the two boards. To create the actual shapes, I considered various options, but quite soon began to think that pierced vellum binding would be suitable. This style was actually used mostly at the time these poems were written. I've seen some examples, though there really aren't very many. Some in the British Library and the Bodleian Library and Folker Shakespeare Library. Parts of the covering vellum were cut away to reveal a different material, in those days often silk or velvet. And the technique also seemed suitable for this book because it echoed the Elizabethan fashion in clothes where the surface of the doublet was slashed to expose coloured material. You can recall that sort of look. So I used a skin of classic vellum and had it buffed down slightly so to make it thinner so there wouldn't be too much of a step at the cut out parts. I'd made a maquette placing some cut vellum onto a small piece of board with coloured papers on it. And I used PVA rather than the 50-50 paste PVA mix, which is what I usually use for vellum. I was worried that the adhesive would squeeze out when I pressed it, but to my amazement, it didn't. And I attributed this to taping down the edges of the vellum when gluing so that it wouldn't curl all over the place, using only PVA with a dryish brush and a little bit of luck. So I decided to use paste papers as the underlays. So I made a load of paste papers. And there are some plain papers as well. Then came the bit I was putting off, the gluing of the vellum onto the book. I've got more of a description of how this is put together with a later binding. But with this one, I did the front board first and then drew it over the spine into the French grooves and over onto the back board and then left it. And next day I went back to it, and when I returned, I found the result was nowhere near as neat as I'd thought. So I took it apart and decided to cover each board separately and do a tongue and slot binding with the spine as a separate piece. So this shows the underlay, that's the board with the paste papers stuck to it, and the cutout vellum, which will then be placed on top of that, so individually each board. This turned out to be much more controllable, and it's the way I did the rest of my vellum bindings. So I've aimed here for a fresh, uplifting effect that is decorative and also relevant to the text, without making big statements or trying to illustrate the meaning of the poems. Actually, six people and institutions wanted to buy this when it was on exhibition. Couldn't believe it. That's never happened to me before. And I wanted to explore it further and went on to do several more, some of which I'll show. Not all of them, don't worry. Here is I don't think it's quite the next one I did, but quite an early one, The Bricks of Venice, old school press publication. For this one, I used leather for the underlays, which was, again, was applied to the boards of the book, which gives a bit more depth to the appearance, I felt. The cutout shapes include representations of water and buildings and reflects a feeling for the colour and structure of the city, but with a lot of allowance for flights of imagination. I never do anything very literal. These are the hills of Erewhon. Erewhon by Samuel Butler. My design for this book is based on the description of those hills. So what we have here are examples of what I call wavy straight edges, which that might be an oxymoron, I'm not sure. Having drawn these shapes of various hills, I then transferred these to pieces of card and cut them out, creating what you see here. These are then placed, they're numbered and placed onto the binding one by one, and holding them down, I run a short palette along them to create blind lines. The palette is warmed slightly on the finishing stove, and the leather along the wavy edge of the card is slightly dampened. I find you get the best results for blind impression with a combination of damp leather and a warm tool. A variety of goat skins were pared and taped down to millboard, and strips were cut off and laid into the impressions of the blind tooling. It's actually a technique I picked up when I was from Jim Brockman when I was there working for him for a long time, and I sort of ran with it really. And this is the resulting binding. I found a suitable space for the titling, and I'd like to say I planned that, but I have to say I didn't. I hoped and trusted a space would present itself, which it did, so I seized the opportunity. It's because I like an element of chance sometimes to creep in. These are the doubleurs, goatskin doubleurs, edge-to-edge doubleurs, with blind lines continuing a sort of the theme leading into the book. Another Pierce Vellum binding, clearly. The Poet's Eye, this book had rather surreal illustrations of foliage and shrubbery, so I picked up on this and created my own version, and this design very much relates to the pictures inside. The text itself was a selection of poems. I was quite pleased with the way this one turned out, actually. I'm never, ever 100% happy with the end result of my bindings. I wonder if other binders are. The colours I used at first for this binding, and this is with drawing inks on mould-made paper, slightly textured. The colours were even brighter, possibly so bright they were illegal. So I toned them down a little bit. But I do like to work with colour. And the drawing inks on paper gave a much more vibrant appearance than plain or paste papers, I felt. So the owner who commissioned me to do that last binding, The Poet's Eye, was kind enough to suggest I did another similar binding on another book in the same series. They were published in the 1950s. So this was another anthology with similar illustrations, although this time they incorporated aspects of architecture and ruins as well as gardens and foliage. So this picture shows the different stages for making this type of binding. Firstly, the image is drawn onto a piece of paper. That image is then transferred to thin card and cut out. And then laying this card on the vellum, the shapes are drawn and cut out, this time on the vellum. The shapes are also drawn onto the paper that will be under the vellum. So that paper on the left is actually the underlay that's going to be stuck onto the board, and the colours are applied to those areas which are going to be exposed. For the mottled coloured areas, circles are cut from the main piece and replaced with selected areas of another piece of paper on the right, which have been stained with multiple colours. And so the resulting binding was this, Traveller's Verse. I think it works quite well with the other one. I think it's a good companion for the previous one. Next we have, I don't know if you're familiar with the Kickshaws press. The British press operating in France, they are right up my street. They're very inventive and light-hearted with their typography. The owner of the press, John Crombie, writes most of the texts, and they sort of hark back to surreal times of the early 20th century, but still look very contemporary. Because I'm inclined to be more than somewhat frivolous, I came up with this design, another compartmentalized one. And the title of the book is actually the design. So on the front board in that grid there, we've got Gabriel de Lautrec, Le Poisson Mal Récompensé, forgive my pronunciation again, Kickshaws, the name of the press. And then on the back, we've got printed by them in France, 2005, bound by me in England, 2007. So the little compartments contain a variety of leather and paper onlays with tooling in gold and coloured foils and in blind. It's very much in the spirit of the typography inside, which I haven't got a picture of, so you'll have to trust me on that one. This is a bookbinding. I expect most people know what a bookbinding is, where the 6 shortlisted authors of the Booker Prize are presented with a design binding from 6 different binders. This novel concerns the terrible real-life chemical explosion at an American factory in Bhopal in India. The company completely abandoned the people of Bhopal area to the horrific ramifications of their explosion, which continue to this day. The surrounding area is the dark aftermath, and I used a similar tooling pattern to a much earlier binding that we saw before, as the story was told, which we've all completely forgotten about. And then, well, I've never actually seen a chemical explosion, so I had to imagine one, and there it is in the centre. And of course, I've combined here pierced vellum with leather covering as well. When I was a student at Camberwell School of Art, and a couple of years after I left, I was invited to participate in a show of students and ex-students. I put in my binding of Salmacis and Hermaphroditus, the first one that I later jettisoned. Tom Phillips was there, and I found we had a mutual friend who was with him, and she introduced me. He murmured a few words about liking my binding, which was great because I'm a big fan of his work. And whilst we were talking, he took out 12 crumpled pound notes from his pocket, the price of a copy of a humorment at the time, and quite a lot of money to me then. There were pound notes in those days, not coins. This must have been about 1978, I think. He gave me the money and said, "Bind me a copy." So I bought a copy, and 30 years later, I bound it. Well, you can't rush these things. To me, as a big fan of him, it was an exciting but very daunting project. I agonized over it for ages and ages. I didn't feel very confident about it. I wanted it to be really good and was never happy with the designs I came up with. I did actually bind it once, probably sometime in the 80s, but midway through applying that design, I lost confidence in it and took it apart. So the book moved with me from London to Oxford, to Guildford, to Tewkesbury, silently reproachful. And when I realised I was going to meet him again in 2009, on the judging day of the international competition at the Bodleian, he was a judge and I was helping to coordinate that day, I just had to get it done. So I chose this semi-limp binding with multiple interlacing of vellum tapes, which seemed to lend itself quite well. The book is rather a solid chunk. As you can see, I've titled the book on 2 of the vellum tapes that exit the front cover and are slotted into the back cover. I've taken this theme a little further on a couple of other occasions. And I can show you. I'll show you one other one because I've got a few pictures of the making process. This one is much more elaborate. Having made the vellum cover in a normal limp vellum style or structure, I draw out the spacing for the tapes to go in and out of the vellum. Exit and entry points are based on 1 centimetre. So each time a tape emerges, it shows for either 1, 2, 3 or 4 centimetres. And this is the mapping out with some slits cut, including a small hole at the end of each cut to prevent tearing. And this picture shows all the tapes in position on the spine. At this stage, they are a complete pain in the neck. They just twist and curl all over the place and just do not behave or cooperate in any way. 4 of these tapes are the tapes that the book has been sewn on. The others are stuck to the spine, which is rounded and lined with Japanese paper. Having worked out where the tapes will be visible, I apply colour to those areas. And now finally, I'm getting the better of them, getting the better of the tapes, and have them more or less under control. At this stage, they are longer than they need to be. 3 of the 4 sewn ones, though, stay longer and go round the foredge, as in the previous book, and slot into a cut in the back part of the vellum. They basically act as clasps and help to keep the book shut. The others are cut off just short of the foredge and left under the vellum. So this is the resulting binding. It's a semi-limp, again, as the other one was, i.e. it has a thin piece of board, mill board, just slipped inside the turn-ins, inside, no adhesive. It just gives a little bit more body, makes the binding a little bit firmer. And just when you thought you'd seen the last of them, there's another pierced vellum binding. I just wanted to include this one because it's sort of my favourite, I think. The book's very well known, I think, illustrated by Claire Leighton, Through the Woods, and it's been bound by many fellows over the years. Peter Jones and Edgar Mansfield come to mind. It would be fun to have a mini exhibition of everyone who's bound it to compare all the different approaches. As I said to the owner of this, it's probably the most colourful woods anyone has walked through, and she was kind enough to say that the woods in Canada are indeed very colourful. So anyway, the design alludes to trees and hanging branches with petals and water running through the centre and leaf mould along the bottom. Some years ago, quite a few years ago now, I thought it would be really interesting if 2 binders worked on the same book, not just the same title, the actual book, but put it together so that neither sees the other's work until the end. It would really bring into focus the different approaches to the book in hand, and it would also create a strong element of chance for the finished result. I wanted to work with someone whose work I admired. Well, there was no shortage of people there, but I also wanted to work with someone who worked in a completely different way to me. And I have no idea how Peter Jones puts his wonderful book wooden constructions together and carbon fibre things. Sorry, Pete. So I phoned him up and he agreed immediately, which was fantastic. We've done 4 of them so far, these combinations. The first one, I just did the front board, Pete did this back board, and we had a neutral spine with a tongue and slot arrangement so the boards could be added without the other seeing. And then the second one, we just reversed that, so Peter had the front board, I had the back. This is the third one. As you can see, I've got my hand-stained paper here, but it wasn't to be a pierced vellum binding. I had separate pieces of leather as my covering material. And Peter, being much cleverer than me with structure, had provided carbon rods which held our sections of board together. So these outer parts of the board there are just temporary. So we've divided it down the centre of each board, and those are just in place to help me work. Were removed, and Peter then slotted these ones on. We were not a little amazed when we saw each other's work on this one, and perhaps not a little alarmed. Were we morphing into the one binder? I remember his startled reaction when I handed over my finished part. He'd already made his, so it was okay to see it. Quite a jolt. This is actually my favourite of the 4 that we've done. The Shepherd's Calendar. This is Cresset Press, a 1930s production. Again, I divided up the boards into a grid, sort of relating to a calendar. Then I gradually worked on each little compartment in a variety of ways, with onlays, cold tooling, blind tooling, etc. Gradually building it up. And every time I start a book, I think I'm going to have a really tidy area to work in. It hasn't happened yet. I've included this photo to show the way I operate. Organized chaos. Well, chaos anyway. And the finished book looks like this. Panels in the grid are suggestive of trees, both in bloom and leafless, hills, rain, earth, wind, snow, leaves, sun and moon. I've also helpfully added in 12 numbers to show it's a calendar, but not as we know it. The images, of course, are not literal. They lie somewhere between pictorial and abstract. That last copy was on exhibition, and someone wanted to buy it, but it was a commission. Someone had commissioned me to do it, so they asked me to bind another copy. This doesn't happen very often, and it's a slightly tricky request. Presumably, the reason the person who wants to buy it is because they like the design, and of course they're not going to get the same design. Will they like the one they get as much as the original? A worry. Anyway, I accepted the commission. This was to be using sculptured boards, and these are the shapes cut from the upper part of the laminated boards. And here we can see them being applied to the lower part of the lamination. So I'm cutting them out of that piece on the right and applying them to the other part of the board. And this shows them in place. So the second design for this book turned out like this. The onlays at the head and tail and the central band of tooling are all in the recesses of the sculpted boards. I divided the lettering up in the same way as before, but used little onlays instead of lettering direct as I had done with the other one. There are, of course, 12 areas of activity across the central, across the boards, and the skies at the top and the landscapes at the bottom, as tradition dictates. The Heroes, Charles Kingsley, this was printed on vellum, one of only 12 copies actually. It was a bit unruly as the vellum was very wavy and the illustrations were on thick paper. I managed to calm it all down, mainly by leaving it under a heavy weight in a dry atmosphere for quite a while. But that got the better of it. This became a rather celestial as the design developed, but the stories do concern the gods, so I was happy with that. So the central combination of inlays and gold tooling could be taken as a sun or as a shield. It's always best to be ambiguous. The Natural History of Selborne. This lovely edition contains rectangular blocks of wood engravings neatly placed at the beginning of many of the chapters. So this inspired me to create blocks of small designs on the boards of the books. The designs are all based on natural forms as well as the climate, which seems suitable, but done in a very non-literal way, veering into the realms of fantasy and whimsy. Inside, of course, is black and white, but binding for me is generally about colour, which I continue to use, albeit with due respect for the contents. These books are best viewed opened out and next to each other. 2 trees at each side contain and enclose the arrangement of treated panels. A whole variety of treatments of sprinkling, staining, reversed leather, tooling, many things. There's a close-up of a part of the board. The moon is up there with a piece of figured vellum, servicing very well that same vellum that I'd used a long time ago on a previous binding. Down the bottom is a panel of stained with leather dye calf with some sort of blossoms appearing, and a tree on the left. Oh yes, I sometimes sign my books like this. This is the doublure. I don't know if you've been to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but you may, if you have, you may well have seen a fantastic jewel called Alfred's jewel. It's really very, very beautiful thing, King Alfred. And on it is inscribed, "Alfred had me made." And I rather like that. So sometimes I put this as a signature. I was made for whoever. And that's the doublure, which looks very sort of woolly on that photograph, but is actually a very, very nice piece of Finnish reindeer suede. The poet of them all is echoes of a much earlier binding, but more sophisticated, I think. This seemed an appropriate way to do this, as the book is a catalogue of various miniature Shakespeare editions. So on that front board, the blue inlaid leather lines around the perimeter, I've tooled the titles of the 4 collections. So on the left, it's Brush Up Your Shakespeare. Top is Knickerbocker's Shakespeare, Pickering Shakespeare, and More Shakespeare. Those are the 4 groups of Shakespeare books. And the actual title of the catalogue is The Poet of Them All, which is in the middle. The back board is tooled around the perimeter with the subtitle of the catalogue, which is William Shakespeare and Miniature Designer Bindings, from the collection of, and then if you go to the centre, from the collection of Neil and Margaret Albert, 2017. And at the bottom, bound by me for them, which it was. I often do random bits of design and drawings and doodlings on bits of paper when I'm working on completely different books to the book that I'm trying to design. These bits of paper often get lost, but I'm occasionally organised and set things down in a sketchbook. So these are initial thoughts for another book of binding, the Oeuvre story. The novel consists of interconnected stories in 4 different sections: roots, trunk, seeds, and crown. And the various narratives are linked by the presence of and influence of trees. The characters relate to trees as an important part of their lives and the life of the planet. And we find the trees communicating with each other over the years. The book deals with this not in a hippie hugging sort of way, although not necessarily anything wrong with that, but with scientific backing, which has been written about recently in natural history studies. I happen to have read a book called The Secret Life of Trees before this, which is a fascinating book. So the sketches moved to this, they developed into this, and then the final drawing of how I envisaged the binding to be was this. Next, I've got, this is the working drawing, so that's that same image, but this is on a thin piece of paper which is wrapped around the binding and stuck with those bits of masking tape, and the impression of those lines is pushed through onto the leather with a bone folder. It's a standard thing, a working drawing, either for gold tooling or whatever. And this is the design being developed. Some of them are blind lines, some of them have got the colours in them, and there's just sort of working out where the blossoms will go at the top. And those little pieces are cut out from a stained piece of calf skin on the right there. And that's the finished binding. That's how it looked. So we can see that the branches and the roots of the trees interlock and speak to each other. And I've given the trees rather more gold than they used to. This is my latest binding, and it's a fleece press book with illustrations by Buckland Wright. So again, there's lots of nudes. It's full of female nudes. So the whole binding is based on curves, even to the extent of the board edges. It's called baigneuse, and it's built up with scarf jointed pieces of calf together with goatskin onlays and gold tooling for droplets of water as the female nudes come out of the lake. And I'd like to finish with my alphabetic assemblage of bookbinding, which I did a while back. I was lying awake one night and planned out this idea of an assemblage incorporating aspects of bookbinding. I'd filled a type tray many years before with items relating to travel, photographs of carts, shells, and small globes and things. And at that time, I thought I should do a bookbinding one. A friend asked me to do one for his publishing firm, Helicon. Well, I never got round to that, but I had a French stamp showing some bonnet bindings. So this was going to be my starting point in the F compartment for French binding. And about 25 years later, when I actually came to do this, I'd managed to lose the stamp. Anyway, my main influences for this were Joseph Cornell with his mysterious and evocative boxes, and cabinets of curiosity, which I've always loved, whether they be fanciful or serious and scientific. In fact, I have at home a large glass-fronted built-in cupboard, which could be described as a cabinet of curiosities, though I usually think of it as a load of tat, or things that I don't need, bought with money that I haven't got. I also see this as a sort of distant cousin to the containers used by trade binderies in the 19th century, displaying various dummy spines indicating the styles and designs available to customers. The type tray was the obvious thing to use, although I had to remove the original divisions, which didn't relate to the 26 I needed in different sizes. It was to be an alphabetic assemblage. These are just some of the notes that I made in preparation, most of which turned out I used more or less as was. I'll just run through some of the panels, won't do all of them, but we can start with B down on the left-hand side there. I've got loads and loads of bone folders, but I only ever seem to use one really. Anyway, I took a group of them and sculpted them into this little cluster, put them in there, and in the background is some brown leather with blind lines, the theme of the bee, and a bit of buckram at the top as well. And also I wanted to include a few binders in this, and an obvious choice for me was James Brockman. I worked for him for a long time and learned a terrific amount from him. And the books that came through his bindery were actually fabulous to work on. So I popped them in there in the corner. C on the top right there is represented with centre tools and sewing cord, which looked a bit dull, so I jazzed them up with lots of different drawing inks, just ran them through the colours of that. And behind there is calf, which does double duty as a Cambridge panel. Very popular type of decoration used over many centuries. And in front of them is a chained book from a chained library. There's foil there, obviously. I just left the exposed area of the foil, having tooled the word in there. Next to that is gold. So gold is just, I think I used Vaseline just to stick it all down, and left it there. And then I tooled some gouges for G, and I didn't want to wipe the gold off. So that was a bit of luxury, not having to see whether it's stuck or not. We've got headbands down the bottom. You can just see the bottom one, perhaps. It's a sort of symmetrical one. Top one is a beadless, asymmetrical, multicoloured, free-form double headband, which is the sort of thing I like to use on design bindings. That's the central panel. Another binder appears. Trevor Jones. There's many contenders for my favourite binder. He's certainly one of them. And he is presiding over a sort of waterfall, a cascade of Japanese papers. Japanese papers, of course, used a lot in bookbinding these days, and also for repair. Next to that is sewing keys for K, and I put those into this panel, and they sort of reminded me, they looked to me a bit like a sort of hidden alphabet of some sort, and then but I did realise that actually they are referred to as H keys and A keys. Below that marble paper, there are steps leading down to the middle bit, which is marrel, which was a famous invention of Philip Smith, of sticking a load of leather together and slicing through it. And there we have our third and final binder, who needs no introduction, Mr. Bernard Middleton. The bottom one, that's a busy one. A load of my paste papers raining down onto a landscape of puckered leather with a lake and hills, and the two tubes on either side are pairings, leather pairings. And lastly, well, our top left is decorated rolls and some reverse calf. We've got T there for thread, which I screwed a load of hooks around the perimeter of that panel and just laced some sewing thread all over it and stopped when I thought I'd done enough. There's a lot of that in the 1960s, I seem to remember. It may have a name, I don't know. Underneath that is actually uncut books. And I like that because I found in a book by John Carter called ABC for Book Collectors, and he talks about uncut pages, and he says, uncut pages, a term not to be confused with unopened, as it often is by Philistines. So that's told us. V in the middle, more or less, there is pierced vellum with some velvet underneath it. W, bottom left, is that paper made from bark of trees, and I've rolled that up into tubes, so it's sort of reverted back into A wood. They look like tree trunks. I'll just mention the X because I searched and searched. I couldn't find anything in bookbinding that began with an X. So if anybody knows a word that begins with X in bookbinding, you can write me a letter, but please don't post it to me. Right, well, that is more or less the end of my talk. I would just say I hope this alphabetic assemblage is a colourful reminder and visual list of many of the beautiful and tactile materials that we bookbinders have to work with. Materials that work together in so many different ways and whose properties we have to understand and control. So that really is the end. I hope you've found at least something of interest amongst it all. And thank you very much for listening. And hand it back to Mark.
That was great. Thank you, indeed, Lester. Great insight into the work and the craft, and obviously mastering the skills. It's always a delight. I love the juxtaposition of colour and texture that you use. We have had, so excuse me, a few questions. So I'm going to pick one from the top, one from the middle, and one from the bottom. And lots of wonderful comments as well about your work, which you probably won't be seeing because you were concentrating on what you were doing. But from wow, beautiful, astonishing, etc., etc., etc. I don't want to make you feel any more than you are, but it was absolutely. Anyway, the first question, if you don't mind answering it, it would be nice.
I'll have a go.
I think that's great. Now, with your vellum work and your pierced vellum work, and I've made a note of this, are the vellum cutouts done individually by hand, or do you use a die or something else? How do you do that?
No, I use a scalpel. Purely use a scalpel. For the circles, I use a hole punch. But yeah, it's all drawn onto the vellum, so I've got a line to follow, and just with a scalpel.
Fantastic. It looks seamless. It really does. Wonderful.
Well, I did consider there is something called a laser cutter, but that might be a bit too sophisticated for me. I'm not sure.
I don't even know how to spell that. And a question from the middle. What sort of inks do you use? You've mentioned that you colour paper and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Do you have any specific?
They're drawing inks, just standard Winsor & Newton, Daler Rowney drawing inks. And I didn't mention this, but they combine with leather dyes. So sometimes I've got a mixture of the two together.
Is that water or spirit dyes?
Well, I know this sounds really odd, but it is spirit dyes. They seem to sort of go all right. I know that doesn't make sense, but it seems okay.
If it works for you, it works for you. That's absolutely
fine.
Just a couple more, actually. Do you prefer to bind books with text blocks that have got illustrations and text, or just illustrations, or what sort of books do you prefer? Text books do you prefer to bind? Illustrations.
Yeah, I suppose I prefer illustrated books if I can relate to them well. I found I could relate to those poetry anthologies quite well. So on balance, probably illustrated books. But what I find quite difficult is binding books on a particular artist, because obviously the book is full of their pictures and you don't want to copy them. but you've got to sort of respect them, but you've got to sort of find your own way around them.
Yeah, it can be a minefield. I know that.
Yes, yeah.
And finally, with your covering materials, which do you prefer? Leather, goatskin, calf, or vellum? Which do you prefer?
I've done so many lint vellum and pierced vellum bindings, but I prefer leather. It doesn't fight back like vellum can do, and it's just it's nicer to manipulate.
Yeah, yeah. I do. I myself, I vellum's got its place, and I love using it. But for sheer
Yeah,
manipulation, we can't beat leather, I think.
yeah.
That seems to be the questions, one from the middle, couple from the top, or whatever. Thank you very, very much, Lester. Absolutely superb once again, and a great insight to your work. Just before we all go, thank you all very much indeed for watching and being with us. This lecture will be available, you lucky people, on the Designer Bookbinders YouTube channel. So you can watch it time and time and time again. Please tell your friends. For news, events, exhibitions, masterclasses, current work, lectures, etc., 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 or indeed the benefits of being a member of Designer Bookbinders, please visit www.designerbookbinders.org.uk, or of course our social media sites. Just search Designer Bookbinders or Designer Bookbinders UK, hashtag, Facebook, whatever it is, and I'm sure we'll pop up everywhere. That's about it. We look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Once again, thank you and goodbye, everybody.